So, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Eliza Perry. Welcome to the very first installment of the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska's Nature Unites Us online learning series. I hope everyone joining today is safe and healthy and as well as is possible right now. So again, my name is Eliza Perry. I've been with TNC for 7 years in various roles, now as donor relations manager, and I am just so genuinely happy to see you today. As we've got other folks joining, I'm just gonna respond to a couple people. Okay.
Hey, Liza, do you want me to talk a little bit while you do that?
Nope, I'm good. I think I've gotten everybody
Okay.
in. But folks are just joining as we go, so welcome to
Yep.
those who are new. So, great. I do want to start today by acknowledging that this event is occurring in incredibly stressful times for many of us on this call, and perhaps most of all, any people of color joining today. In the words of Cassandra James and Kia Thomas, co-leads for the Nature Conservancy's League of Employees of African Descent, quote, as our world is experiencing the compounding effects of generations of racism, inequity, and injustice, we acknowledge that our organization has not been at the forefront of this conversation, and we no longer have the luxury or privilege to remain silent, end quote. I encourage you to visit our website, nature.org, for more from Cassandra and Kia inside of our CEO, Jennifer Morris's full statement on the recent acts of racism in the United States and ongoing protests spreading around the world. We ask you to consider lifting up messages from the organizers of Black Birders Week. Diversity is its own benefit, and we need more naturalists, as all of you would agree. I know that's a goal of Chris as our Director of Science. I'm going to hand it over to Chris in just a moment, but first I have a couple logistics to share. So just please look at the bottom of your Zoom screen for the Q&A button, which can be used to submit questions for Chris anytime. If you have technical issues, email me, eperry@tnc.org, which was in all of the emails you've received from us on this. And if we get cut off for any reason, just return to that email to find the very same link, click that, and we'll reconvene as soon as possible. So finally, this is being recorded. We will send out the link to all participants as soon as we've completed closed captioning for the video, which should be by the end of this week or early next. And we encourage you to share it very widely. Again, thank you so much for being here with us. And Chris, why don't you take it away?
All right. Hi, everybody. So my name is Chris Helzer. I'm the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska. I've been with the organization 23 years, starting as a land manager and then moving gradually more and more into a science and outreach role, but still involved in our land management work, mostly helping our land managers evaluate the success of what we're doing and trying to figure out how to keep getting better and then sharing what they're learning with other people. I want to talk real briefly about the Nature Conservancy, but this is not an advertisement for the organization, as much as I just want to make sure that you know who I am and where I'm coming from. So, our mission is pretty broad, but it's trying to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. That has been something that has been pretty stable throughout the organization's history since 1951. When it started, I would say the big changes have been we keep looking broader and broader and trying to raise the level of our impact over time. We're the world's largest conservation organization. We work in 69 countries, or maybe more than that now. So we're global, but one of the things that I've always told people that I appreciate the most is that we are allowed to work in ways that make sense locally. And so the work that we do here in Nebraska is designed for Nebraska, and it's very different than what we do in places like Virginia or California or Indonesia or China. So having said that, I want to talk about photography today. And the theme here is this, which is your camera doesn't see like you do. And everybody's got their own camera, and I can't teach you how to use your own camera because there's too many of you. But what I'm hoping to do is show you what kinds of things you should look up or you should figure out how to do with your camera that'll help you be a better photographer. And that should work regardless of what kind of machine you're using to take pictures. And it's important to remember that photography is not documentation. You are not documenting exactly what a scene looks like with your camera because the camera is interpreting what that scene looks like. And so I think you want to get away from the idea that you're trying to capture something exactly, and then think about how do you want to interpret what you're seeing in a way that's helpful to you or others or whatever your objective is. So if you can learn how your camera is seeing the world and the unique ways in which it interprets what it sees, then you can use that to make art or tell stories or do whatever it is you're trying to do. And again, this works with cell phone cameras, point and shoot cameras, digital SLR cameras, film cameras, it doesn't matter. All the principles we talk about today will be basically the same. So let's start with field of view. In other words, what amount or what area of the world is a camera able to see at a certain time. And you control this with lenses, if you have a camera that you can exchange lenses with, or you can control it by zooming in and out if you have a camera that allows you to do that, or you change it by just moving where you aim the camera. But if you have the ability to use multiple lenses, wide angle lenses are a really nice way to see, you know, a big angle, a lot of different things at once. It's great for big sweeping landscapes where you want to show the sky. If you want to see the entire rainbow from where it comes up out of the ground and back down into the ground, you know, not literally, of course. It's also really nice though for showing depth. You can put the camera close to something and also show sort of the distance and the depth of a scene. Wide angle lenses are really great for that. You can get close to something and look at the distance, but also don't forget to turn it vertically. Wide angle lenses in a vertical format can be really helpful in showing the depth, especially in a scene, even more than something horizontal. And then I use wide angle lenses a lot for close-ups where I want to show a turtle, for example, ornate box turtle here, in its landscape. And so you can show sort of the context for an image in a way that's really difficult to do with a macro lens, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And I just recently bought myself a fisheye lens, which is a kind of an ultra wide angle lens that has a lot of curvature around the edges of it. It's got a lot of distortion at the edges, but it's also really nice for this kind of photo where you want to show a close-up of a flower, but also show the context, in this case, of my backyard, and also my neighbor's fence and the alley all the way down to the street and the sun. You can pack a lot into one photo with some of these really ultra wide angle lenses. And then this is a little bit more of a specialty thing, but this is a photo taken with a wide angle lens on an extension tube, which is basically a ring that you can put between a lens and your camera to change where the plane or focus is. And in this case, it allowed me to take a wide angle lens and get that lens to focus much more closely than it had before. And the bottom petal on this photo, this flower, is almost touching the lens of the camera. That's how close I am to this little tiny flower. So this is a little trickier. This is not something you can do with any camera, but the principle here is use wide angle lenses or use the fully zoomed out, you know, ability of your phone or point and shoot camera for a lot of different things, not just sort of taking a picture of a rainbow. And then I guess the other end of that spectrum would be a long lens or a telephoto lens, which is what you would want to use for photographing wildlife. This is a grasshopper sparrow with a grasshopper. This lens that I used for this was a 300 millimeter lens, which is actually a little short, a little small for wildlife photos, but this bird landed really close to me. I was really lucky, and I sat still and took a picture. But you know, if you see sports photographers, they're carrying lenses that are 400 millimeter, 500 millimeter lens, the great big honking things. Those can get really pricey, especially for a high quality one. But if you're serious about wildlife photography, the more you can spend on your lens, the better opportunity you'll get for some of the species that you can't get really close to. So you can use them for photographing animals, wildlife, but long lenses, telephoto lenses, can also be really handy for scenic photos. And one of the reasons for that is you can sort of reach out into the landscape and pick a portion of the landscape that you really want to focus on. And in addition to that, a telephoto lens compresses what the landscape looks like. If you've ever seen sports photos where it looks like the players on a field are really close to each other, they're probably not, but a lens like that compresses things and make them look closer to than they are, which can be handy for sometimes like a landscape photo, especially for something like the sandhills in Nebraska, where we have this immense landscape, and it can sometimes be really hard to capture what that landscape really looks like. And I've found that standing on a hill with a long telephoto lens actually helps me capture what it feels like to be in that landscape much more often than a wide angle lens, because a wide angle lens makes everything look like it's further away and it shows a lot of sky, which can also be impressive. But sometimes you just want to show how many hills there are between you and the horizon, and a long telephoto lens can be really helpful for that. If you've ever taken a picture of the moon or the sun as it rises, you've probably noticed that it looks a lot different in the photo than it did in real life. So on a morning like this, where the sun was humongous in the distance, I put on my 300mm lens and took this photo so that it magnified the sun in the image to make it look more like it did in real life. It also compressed those hills again and provided some really nice layering in the image in the foreground. And then you can use macro lenses. If you know anything about my photography, this is the lens I use more than any other. I take a lot of insect photos, a lot of flower photos. I love to get in there close and show people things that maybe you wouldn't normally pay attention to because you walked past or you just didn't look closely enough. And a macro lens can be a really neat pathway into a different world. My photography changed dramatically, and my naturalist abilities and my focus as a naturalist changed dramatically once I got a macro lens for my camera. And I started looking differently at the world and finding things like, the opening in the elbow of a katydid where it hears, because a katydid listens through its elbow, not through its head. They're just things like that it's hard to find and capture those things without some kind of magnification. So a macro lens can be really handy. I have a 105mm macro lens for my camera that I use, which gives me a little bit of a distance between the subject and myself, so I don't have to put the camera right in the face of this katydid. I can be 8 or 10 inches away and still get a reasonably good shot. But you can get lots of different kinds of macro lenses depending on what you want to do. Okay, and by the way, I'm going to stop several times for questions as we go. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and then when we stop, Eliza will try to get through as many as we can each time I stop. And then at the end, I can stay until 2 o'clock. So we have a lot of people on. So if there are a lot of questions, we want to keep going until 2 o'clock. If you're willing to stick around, I'm willing to stick around. We'll try to get as many of them answered as we can. So I want to talk about focusing. When you take a photo like the one here on the screen, everything in the photo is basically far enough away that it's in the same plane of focus. And so focusing is really easy. I can focus at infinity, and I can get the bison and the sandhills and the clouds all to be in focus at the same time without really worrying about anything. It gets trickier if you're in a scene where there are some things pretty close to you and also some things very far away, and you want all of that to be, if not in focus, at least reasonably focused so that it's not distracting. And in that case, you need to think about where your camera is going to focus, and you need to understand how your camera is focusing, which seems like a simple concept, but it really can be very different from camera to camera. And you need to understand what the setting is that your camera uses as a default and what settings you have the option to change. So a lot of cameras have a set of sensors like this where they're focusing, they're reaching out and looking at different parts of the image and trying to figure out where it should focus, what the distance is, and it's making decisions about what's in focus and what's not. And if you let the camera make those decisions, it will, but you may or may not be happy with that, especially if what you want to be in focus is on the corner of a photo rather than in the center. So most cameras have the ability in one way or the other for you to select a part of the frame to focus on before you take the picture. With a lot of cell phones, you can touch your finger to a part of the image before you take the picture, and that'll tell the camera to focus right there. With a digital SLR camera like I've got, you can move this little rectangle around in your image until it gets on top of where you want to focus. And then when you push your shutter button down halfway to focus the camera, it'll focus right there. Or you can manual focus, of course. Whatever the way your camera does it, you want to know how to do that, because if you focus out on the hills in this particular image, the sumac leaves in the foreground are going to be out of focus, which is not what I wanted out of this image. Sometimes it can be really dramatic when you're looking at close-up photos especially. So I really wanted the droplet of water here to be in focus. I didn't care so much about the flower behind it. In fact, I kind of was fine with the flower being out of focus. So I had to make sure that I knew exactly where the camera was focusing. Now, sometimes if you have a camera, then you don't want to mess around with moving something around. One way to do that is to move your camera so that whatever it is you want to focus on is in the middle. And you can press the shutter button halfway down and then reframe the photo and push it all the way, and it'll keep that first object in focus. But again, just know what your camera does and how it handles focus, and you can solve the problem. Usually with animals of any kind, the most important thing to have in focus is the eye. Because as humans, when we look at another creature, we tend to go eye to eye. We're drawn to their eye. And if you look at an animal and the eye is not out of focus, or it's not in focus, there's a discomfort there, there's a tension there, which if you're doing that on purpose, that's an artistic choice and that's fine. But recognize that even if the nose of a frog is out of focus, if the eyes are clear, people are not going to pay much attention to the out of focus parts. They're going to be looking at the eyes of the frog, and that's the most important part. Okay, so this is our first time where we can stop and ask a few questions. Take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll jump back in. So what do we have so far, Eliza?
Hey there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I'm going to start with questions we got in advance. We received several about equipment and what's the best equipment to start with. What are your recommendations?
Good. Let me just talk about what I have and why. When you're looking at equipment, it's not necessary I mean, you don't have to sell your house to buy good camera equipment. This is a list of what I have. If you want to take a picture of the screen, you're welcome to. Here's the most essential components of what I have. So I have I bought a used camera body, which is an older version of a Nikon camera body. It's not a high-end camera. I spent about $400 for a used version of it. For me, the essential lenses that I want are a macro lens, some kind of a telephoto, and a wide angle. The telephoto I have right now, Nikon happens to make one that goes from 18 to 300 millimeters, which is basically a wide angle lens that zooms all the way into a telephoto, which is pretty extraordinary. And it covers what I need for that 300 millimeter lens. You don't have to do that. You can get just a straight 300 millimeter lens. The wide angle lens I've had for a while. I really like it. And then again, you can see the fisheye lens here. The other thing that's really important though is a tripod. If you're going to do any kind of serious photography, especially in low light or in macro photography, anything like that, the tripod is really essential for helping to stabilize the camera when you're doing slow shutter speeds, which I'll talk about in a little while. But also it just helps me both stabilize the camera, but also think more carefully about the composition, because I can set it and look at it and think about it and make slight adjustments rather than trying to handhold it. And so tripods are not cheap if you buy good ones. The one I bought, the one that I carry most of the time, I was looking for something where the legs would spread all the way out so that I could get flat to the ground. The one I bought didn't quite do that, but I was able to modify it with a grinder to make the legs do what I wanted. And then I have a bigger lens or a bigger tripod that I use if I'm doing wildlife photography, but I don't use it very often. So the point here is people ask, what kind of camera should I get? Get a camera that is going to be able to use the lenses that you think you want. Don't spend a lot of money on the camera. The high-end cameras, the biggest advantage of a lot of those high-end cameras is if you're going to be doing something like photographing birds in flight, you need something that can focus track a bird as it flies away from you. I don't do a lot of that. I don't need the fancy focus tracking. And so what I really want is a box that has a sensor in the back that a lens can attach to. And that's basically what a lot of these cameras are. So for a few $100s, you can get yourself a really good camera body. And then spend your money on lenses and buy used almost all the time. I almost never buy lenses or camera equipment new. Let's see. And then somebody asked about, one of the early questions was, I have an old film camera. Can I still, or no, I have an old film camera and lenses to go with it. Can I use those lenses on a digital camera now? And the answer to that is probably yes. But the lenses may or may not work exactly the same way. So a lot of times what happens is the digital camera might have a sensor that's a different size than the film you used to use. And so what used to be a 50mm lens on a film camera might work as a 75mm lens on a digital camera, as an example. So those are things you just have to look at. I think the question specifically was from a Pentax owner, and there are digital Pentax cameras, and they should be able to use the lenses that you have from your old Pentax camera. Again, they may be a little different in practice, but I'm not an expert enough to tell you exactly what to do. I just know that you can do it if you look into it. Whew. Okay, Eliza, what else?
Thanks, Chris. I have a maybe similar question. What do I do with my old Exacta SLR lenses? Any way to adapt them?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either. That's a Google question, or a question for somebody who knows that kind of equipment. I don't, sorry.
Okay, and then with macro lens, is a handheld possible or tripod only?
Yeah, both can work. I'm going to talk here pretty soon about depth of field. And depth of field in macro photography is really important. And if you want more depth of field, you have to use a slower shutter speed. And if you're using a slower shutter speed, it gets really hard to handhold things. So I do both. If I'm photographing something that's right on the ground, sometimes I'll put the camera right on the ground. If I can use a tripod, I will. And sometimes I'll do a combination where I'll use the camera on a tripod, but I'll fold the legs together and use it as a monopod, which allows me to sort of swing the camera back and forth, but still have more stability. So it's a really hybrid thing, but I would strongly recommend having a tripod and carrying it with you and getting used to using it whenever you can. It does make a difference. How about one more?
I apologize if you already covered this, and you might have, but can you tell me what size your macro lens is, and is it expensive? And that's the last one.
Yep, sure. No, it's on the screen here. It's a 105mm macro lens. If you're going to do a lot of insect photography, a 200mm macro lens is a nice option. It allows you to get, again, a little bit more distance from whatever it is you're photographing without scaring it off. If you want something with more context behind it, then a 50mm macro lens or 40mm could work really well. For me, the 105 on my digital camera actually functions more like a 160mm camera or lens, which is close to a 200, and so that works for me. Okay, go ahead, Eliza.
I'm sorry, just a very kind participant said that they looked into Exacta lenses, and there are hacks out there that will let you use them on other cameras, but the lenses will all be manual focus. Thanks to Scott for that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Scott. Okay, it might be the most important topic of the day. Light intensity it's just so important in photography. And it's really important to know that your camera can't handle the range of intensity of light that your eyes and brain together can handle. So what I mean by that is when you look at a sunset like this in real life, you can see the details in the foreground in this photo that are blacked out because they're really dark, and in the clouds above. But part of the reason you can is that you're shifting your eyes around to look just at that, and then your pupils dilate and undilate in ways that allow you to compensate for that light. Your camera can't do that. Your camera gets one pupil size for a photo, And so you have to choose what range or what section of the light intensity you want the camera to expose for and make not too bright and not too dark. I'll explain that as we go here. So here's a photo from Nature Conservancy site in Illinois. This is in the Nebraska grasslands several years ago. And this photo was taken late enough in the morning that it's starting to get pretty bright, and the shadows, the difference between the shadows and the brightly lit parts of the image are right at the edges of what the camera can handle. If you look at those trees, the shadowed part of the trees are so dark you can't see any details. Some of the shadows between the plants in the foreground are so dark you can't see details. And yet, I didn't want to make this any brighter because the yellows and the flowers would go white. The barn in the background would sort of wash out. I was trying to work right in that spot in the middle of, okay, some things are going to be too dark, some things are too light, but I want most of the scene to look okay. But this is on the edge of being able to do that. This photo was just a little bit later in the morning where it was too bright to do what I wanted to do, but I was still trying to make it work. And what I want to show you here is, so look at how the highlights on the leaves in the foreground are washed out. You can't see all the details there. And yet there are shadows that hide a lot of what's happening in the foreground. The background here is white. The sky is pretty much all white and washed out. So I could change my exposure. I could tell the camera to take a darker photo or a brighter photo. If I went brighter, I can see more details in the shadows, but now everything's washed out. It's not what I want to do. And if I go darker, I can get the leaf in the foreground. I can see the detail better, but now the shadows are really getting distracting and dark, and I'm losing a lot of what's going on there. And again, the reason for this is that cameras and the sensors of the camera can only register a section of that spectrum of light intensity from dark to light. And it's really important to understand that. And I'll give you some hints on how you can compensate that for a second, or in a minute. The first one is, if you have the choice, so in those photos I just showed you, I tried it lighter, I tried it darker. If you can, go darker, because later on, if you have the ability to use any kind of software to adjust images, it's a lot easier to recapture details that are lost in shadows than something that's been washed out on the bright end. You cannot find and recapture anything that's been washed out because it was too bright. But if it's too dark, you can usually recapture at least some of the details there and compensate. So if you're not sure, take several pictures of whatever it is you're taking pictures of and shoot some of them so that they look a little darker on your screen, and then you can work on those later. So here's an example of a photo that I took. This is what it looked like coming out of the camera, but this is not what I saw in real life. So this gets back to the interpretation part, using cameras to interpret what you see. My eyes saw this photo, and the flowers in the foreground were lit up beautifully. They were bright yellow with the light coming through the petals. The sky was turning orange. It was a lot darker than this photo. But this is the way I told the camera to capture the scene, because I knew that I could come in later with Photoshop and make some adjustments to make that scene look like what I needed to. So I shot it so that the foreground is darker than I wanted it, so that the sky was not completely washed out, because I needed to get a little color in the sky, so I had something to work with. And then this is the finished photo. This is what the image looked like to me when I was out there. And I was able to sort of brighten up the shadows in the foreground and get those flowers to show the way that they were being lit up from behind. They were glowing in that light. And I was able to show a little bit more detail in the sky and some rays of the sun that I was looking at also. So there are going to be people, I'm sure, that look at this and say, well, now you're cheating, right? You're using Photoshop to make an image rather than your camera. And I would say that that's photography. And all the way back to black and white photographers with dodging and burning in the darkroom, that's part of the process. And we just have much better tools now to do that sort of manipulation, to try to move past the limitations of our cameras to show what we want to show in a scene. But everybody can make their own decisions about what degree of that kind of manipulation you're comfortable with, and that's something that's completely up to you. I would not, for example, add a deer to this image that wasn't there, or anything like that. But I don't mind changing the brightness and darkness of a scene to show what my eyes actually see in real life. So speaking of light intensity then, so in an image like this, what I wanted was the river. I wanted to set a mood. I wanted the river to be seen. I didn't care if everything else went black. And you can take advantage of your camera's limitations to make some really interesting looking images, right? So here's a spider that had its web across the burrow of a badger. And what was behind it was shadowed, but the sun, the bright sunlight was hitting the spider. And the contrast between the shadows and the spider were so great that I could have the spider be exactly correctly exposed and the shadows behind it went completely black, making a really interesting image that because I was looking for that image, because I knew what it was going to do, I made the choice to do it. I wasn't disappointed by it. I was happy with it. And here's the opposite, where the sky behind this flower was so bright that I knew it was going to be washed out, but I really needed the flower and the tree cricket to be correctly exposed. And I was okay with the background being sort of an artistic white background. Another example of that here with this red-bellied woodpecker in a snowstorm, the background was brighter than the camera could handle, so it just completely washed out, which makes a really interesting image. And you can still see the snowflakes coming across in front of the tree there to show that it was snowing and set a little bit of the scene. So what your camera really is trying to do, if you say, hey camera, you decide how bright to make this photo, it's going to try to make the photo a neutral tone, not too bright, not too dark, something right smack in the middle. And if you have an image like this one, where everything is a neutral tone, your camera will have no trouble with that, right? There's nothing in this photo that's too bright, too dark. The amount of contrast and light intensity across the scene is very little. Cameras handle that really well. Another example here, right? So the sun behind the clouds gets washed out. Everything else is pretty much the same tone. That's great. That's an easy photo for a camera to decide, you know, what light density to use here, what tone. And the way that your camera is doing that is it's using a light meter. So almost every camera you have today has an internal light meter where it's taking readings from different parts of the scene and trying to decide based on those readings how light or dark to make that image. And if it's averaging across the entire scene, a scene like this is going to turn out just fine. But if you have a scene where you have parts of it that are really bright and parts of it that are really dark, the average of that may not be what you want it to be. And so you need to know how your camera is making those decisions and then try to decide whether you're going to let the camera do that or try to take more control. So in this case, an average may or may not give you what you want. So what you want to do is, you know, going back to this scene, maybe try metering off the sky and you say, okay, I want the sky to be a neutral color so that the river is a little brighter and the foreground's a little darker. Or maybe you want to make sure that if the river is the most important thing, decide how bright you want that. Everything else can go where it needs to. You can move around and focus or meter on different parts of this scene. And then, you know, and obviously with digital cameras, the nice thing is you can take 8 or 10 or 20 pictures of this and try it different ways until you get what you want. Where it's really tricky is when the light's changing fast or something's moving or something's not going to sit and allow you to take 20 pictures to see what looks good. You want to know how to make some of these decisions faster than that. So here's a photo where, you know, the butterfly was the important part. I metered off the butterfly to make the light exposure correct on the wing. I didn't care so much about the background. We already talked about this one. And this is next place to stop. So we covered a lot there. And again, light intensity to me is probably the most important thing we're going to talk about today. So if there's questions on that, now would be a good time to talk about some of those.
Hey there. We have some fabulous questions. And I do want to remind folks that Chris is down to stay on for another 30 minutes. So if we don't get through all of these, we can get through them then. I'll start with the most recent one. Do you recommend moving to manual function as soon as possible once you are comfortable working with the camera? Are the functions you are given ever worth working with for shutter / ISO / aperture control?
Yeah, I use manual most of the time for everything that I do. Part of that is because that's what I got used to. I started on manual cameras with very few options to do anything else, which was an advantage in some ways. there's nothing wrong with using shutter speed priority or aperture priority. And in some cases, there's a lot of advantage to that. You know, if you're taking pictures of sandhill cranes on the river and it's a pretty bright day, and the biggest thing you're worried about is making sure that you can freeze the action. You want to use a fast shutter speed. Maybe you set your camera to say, okay, don't go below 500th of a second shutter speed, and then expose based on that. And a lot of times that can be really helpful as long as you're checking to make sure that the color and the tone looks right. But if you've got time, I find that the more you set the settings manually, especially with digital cameras that make it pretty easy to see if it's going well or not, the more you do that, the better control you have, the better photos you get because you're paying more attention, and it makes me more thoughtful photographer. But that doesn't mean that if you're using program settings, you're a bad person or you're taking bad pictures. It just means that in some cases you might be disappointed if you're not paying close enough attention.
Great. These are questions that would relate to the last section. Did you mention where you go to get used equipment?
Oh, good question. You can go a lot of different places. I've bought lenses off of the internet, Craigslist, eBay, those sorts of things. I've bought from camera dealers like Adorama or B&H or Lead Camera or Ace Photography, or there's a bunch of different places online. Amazon, you can usually find things. It kind of depends on what you want to do. If you're buying from Craigslist or eBay, you're taking someone's word for the condition of that equipment, and sometimes you're going to get something that's not what you thought. As opposed to if you buy from a camera company that deals in photography equipment, they're going to have a range that'll say, you know, this is an 8 in quality. It's you know, it's excellent, or it's good, or it's fair, and they'll have definitions of what that actually means. So you'll know by looking at their description pretty well what you're getting in terms of whether it's going to have a scratch on the lens or if it's old and dusty or whatever. So there's a lot of options. If you're not sure, I would buy from a camera company that sells used photo equipment for a business, and you'll usually have better luck with them. And they're all online.
What do you think of the macro and zooming capabilities of the phone cameras? Are any dramatically better than others?
I mean, I haven't used them all, so I can't comment on all of them, but I'll say that they are getting better. I have a Samsung phone right now that I love. It takes amazing photos. And the thing that you have to be careful on in terms of zooming is that most cameras, there are a few now that actually have an optical zoom, meaning that there's a lens that actually changes shape, or they have two different lenses, one that's, you know, a little wider angle, one that's not. But if you don't have that, what your camera is really doing is cropping. It's if you're zooming in on something, it's not really changing the optics. It's just zooming in on a smaller part of that same photo. And when you blow that up, you'll be able to tell it gets grainy. So there are big limitations to cell phones. If you're going to take pictures of birds or wildlife of any kind, a cell phone is probably not going to get you what you want. But for all other things, boy, I tell you, when I'm hiking or when I'm out, even if I have my actual camera with me, a lot of times for a photo just to show where I'm at or what a scene looks like, I'll grab my cell phone because it takes a great photo and it's easy.
Do you ever shoot in the RAW setting, and are you going to talk about RAW at all?
I wasn't, but that's something I can quickly do. Yes, I always shoot in RAW, which is the format. Basically, RAW is the format that the camera embeds the information in, and then I bring that into Photoshop and work it from there. If you're shooting in JPEG, there are decisions that your camera is making for you in terms of how much information to keep that I'm not comfortable with. The disadvantage, though, of a raw image is that you can't just take a picture and then post it someplace. You have to, you know, do something with it in software to make it of a format that other people can use. So I use raw format, and then I reformat things as I work them, and I save them as a low resolution JPEG, and I save them as a high resolution TIFF image. And if I'm working with a magazine, I send them the high resolution TIFF. If I'm posting on Facebook or Instagram, I use the low resolution JPEG.
Okay, I've got a bunch more, so stop me when you.
Yeah, let's maybe two more, and then we'll jump to do some more later.
Okay. Uh, what software do you use to edit your photos, and how much of a learning curve was there to figure out how to manipulate photos to show what you want to see?
I have two things that I'm currently using. The first thing I use is a program called Photo Mechanic, which is a browsing software. That's what I use when I get, I come back from a long day in the field. I might have 2,000 photos in my camera, and I need to be able to go through those and decide, okay, which picture of this toad is the best one. And it allows me to flip very quickly back and forth and focus in and decide which one is the most sharp and the best light. I can tag that and then save that and get rid of all the other ones. So Photo Mechanic is a great program to do that kind of browsing. It's a $150 program, I think. Last time I checked, it's not terribly expensive. And then I use Photoshop because that's what I've gotten to learn. And there is a learning curve on it. The best way to learn is to talk to a photographer who uses it in a similar way to you and ask them what kinds of things they do. Because Photoshop does amazing things, but it does so many things that it's sort of bewildering. But Photoshop is not the only program. There are a lot of freeware software programs online that do a really nice job of editing and doing what you need with photos. So if you don't want to spend the money for Photoshop, that's completely understandable. GIMP is one, GIMP is one that I know people enjoy. That's a freeware software program online.
White balance settings for cell phones. What situations do you recommend changing settings?
You know, because I am going to manipulate most of my photos later and adjust the light anyway, I don't worry too much about white balance on either of my cameras, my cell phone or my regular camera. But I would say if you have an option that says daylight, that's probably the best setting for most of what you're going to do outside anyway. And even if it's something where you're going to work in the dark or whatever, it's probably going to be okay. If you're going to have one setting, I'd probably go with the daylight setting. But I really don't play around with that enough to know very much about it. All right, one more.
Okay, sorry. Any tips for dealing with the glare when trying to take pictures outside? When shooting with my phone outside, sometimes I can't see it all when I'm pointing at.
Yeah, that is tough. So there's two things. One, the better you know your camera, the easier that'll be because you don't have to check it as much. The other thing is, take a picture, turn around, shade the camera, check the screen, see how it looks, and then make your adjustments and then go back out to it. But yeah, that's tough. Those LCD screens in bright sunlight are not great. All right, let's move on here. And if we don't get through all these slides, that's fine. I'm going to go as far as we can and show you as much. The things at the end are not as important as these that I'm talking about now. So I want to talk about quality of light because we talked about light intensity and how difficult it is for cameras to deal with that sometimes. There's a couple things to know. So when the sun is lower toward the horizon, the light intensity is less. You have less light intensity because that light is passing through more atmosphere to get to you, and so it's diffused by that. Also, if you have a day with that's like a bright overcast day. So you have thin clouds, you can see the sun through them, you can still see your shadow. That is giving you less light intensity than if the sun is really out there. The other thing is if the sun has color to it, if it doesn't look just white, that means the light that's reflecting off of whatever you're photographing is also going to have color. So going out to take pictures when there's color in the sun is going to give you more colorful photos. And I'll show you some of that here in a second. So when you talk about quality of light, warm direct light would be just what we were talking about. So late in the day, this is an evening photo. The sun was starting to get closer to the horizon. It was turning kind of an oranger color, which gave a kind of a nice golden light and highlights to everything in this image. So this would have been a fine photo an hour before that too, but two things would have been different. A, the light intensity would have been different, would have been higher, and I would have had to make choices between those yellow flowers and the shadows, trying to decide how to balance those in a way that I didn't have to worry about here. And also, it wouldn't have been nearly as warm tone overall as a photo. So that late day, early morning light, there's a reason that photographers really stress that time of day. Another example, right? So sun's hitting this directly, but it's still a warm light because it's early in the day. On this photo, you can look at those white flowers and you can see kind of gold or sort of warm highlights to them in a way that, especially on the stem here, in a way that you would not get, an hour later. And you also don't have to worry about really stark shadows at this time of day that make it hard to see the details in an image. And I talked about bright overcast light. As a macro photographer, my best possible scenario is middle of the day, but the sun goes behind some thin clouds where I can walk out and I can just barely see my shadow. And there's no wind, which those conditions combined don't happen very often, but when they do, I'm outside as much as I can be, because that's a great time to take pictures. You get nice saturated color. You don't get shadows that are distracting you from seeing the details of a flower or any kind of an image that you're taking. It doesn't work really well for landscapes because the sky tends to just wash out completely. But for macro photography, bright overcast light is just amazing to work with, because you can see every little detail in there without having to work with shadows or worried about light intensity issues. You can see here, you can see all the details on these leaves, and there's a little bit of a shadow between the top leaf and the bottom leaf, but not enough that you can't see the details within that. That's a bright overcast day, and that's a perfect example of how it's used. If there's too many clouds, or if you're working in the shade of a forest, then you get this kind of cool flat light. That's not necessarily bad, but you just need to know what it's going to give you. It's going to give you a blue tone in your color of the scene. It's going to be harder to see contrasts, to see the details between one thing and another, because they all sort of blend together in a way that they wouldn't if you had a little bit more light intensity. But it can be really nice for setting certain moods. I mean, for a mountain waterfall, this kind of light is just perfectly fine. So I talked about scenics and bright overcast light. When I'm out in bright overcast light, I minimize how much sky is in an image because it all looks white, and so why put a bunch of it in there? It's just distracting. So the other thing about light, or the angle of the sun coming in, is not only is the light intensity less, but it also means that any shadows you have are going to be behind the subject rather than on it or underneath it. That can be important. So for example, I carefully snuck up to this wild goose out in the prairie and got this photo of its, I'm kidding, of course, but I got a photo of its face. And all the details in the face of this goose decoy are really easy to see, right? Because the shadows are behind it. Same thing with this prairie dog. The light was behind me, so it's full face. Every detail there is illuminated, and you can see everything there. All the shadows are behind it. The contrast is here with this bird during the middle of the day on a bright sunny day. It was already a weird looking bird, but now it looks almost demonic with these scary black flat eyes, because the eyes are shadowed by its eyelids because the sun is coming straight down from on top, and it just makes it look like a creepy little bird instead of a cute little fledgling of a I think black-headed grosbeak. So I'm actually going to skip past that and just move into a couple things before we do questions again. I want to talk about shutter speed and aperture and exposure. And this is stuff that it's not possible for me to cover this in all the detail that we need to quickly, but I want to at least show you enough that you can go off and learn on your own. So the shutter speed, the shutter of a camera, is what controls when light is coming in and for how long. So a fast shutter speed freezes action. A slow shutter speed allows you to kind of see things that move while that shutter is open, and it shows motion in a different way. Both are good. In this photo, I used a fast shutter speed because the wind was blowing these flowers around and I needed to freeze them. I used a really fast shutter speed, probably 1,000th of a second, on this bird because it was singing and its beak was vibrating as it was making its call. This is a photo where it was a 10-second exposure, meaning that the camera shutter was open for 10 seconds at a time. And every time I was waiting for lightning to strike. And so what I would do, I opened up the shutter for 10 seconds and then I would close it. And I'd do that again and again and again, hoping that during that 10 seconds, there would be a lightning strike. And it happened, in about 10% of the photos that I tried to take that evening. It worked out okay. Again, slower shutter speeds show motion. That's a good or bad thing, depending on what you want. If you're trying to handhold a camera, whether it's a cell phone or a digital SLR or a point and shoot, about a 60th of a second is what you need to keep your hands from shaking in a way that affect the image. That's going to be different for every person, of course. Some people have shakier hands or steadier hands than others. And the longer focal length, so if you're using a 300 millimeter lens, you're going to need a higher shutter speed, partly because of the weight and partly because of the optics. And the rule of thumb usually is you want a shutter speed that's at least as fast as the focal length, meaning that if you have a 300 millimeter lens on, the minimum shutter speed you want is 300th of a second. But I would always go faster if you can. So what is exposure? Basically, again, your camera is a box with a sensor on the back of it. There's a hole in the front that lets light through. That's the aperture. And then the shutter speed, the shutter is what closes and opens that hole. So shutter speed is how long that hole is open. And so there are two things that control how much light hits the sensor. Shutter speed, so faster shutter speed means less light, and the aperture, meaning where a smaller opening means less light. So if you look at this again, think of it as water coming in, right? If you want to do it that way. If you have a smaller hole, it takes more time to get the same amount of water into a box as it does with a bigger hole. And shutter speed means you can open and close that and control the amount of light coming in. So those are the two controls that you have over how much light you get. F-stops is a way of talking about the size of the opening. And again, this is something you need to stare at for a while to understand if this is the first time you've seen it. But an f-stop is, on a camera, they're most of the time going to be twice or half the previous number. So if you move from an f8 to an f11, you're halving the amount of light as you go up. And the reason that it gets smaller as you go to bigger numbers is that it's expressed as a fraction, which it's sort of counterintuitive until you realize that it's a fraction. Again, here, the shutter speed and aperture work together. They're complementary. So if you take a picture at the left exposure here, a 30th of a second photo at an aperture of 5.6, you're getting the exact same amount of light if you go twice as fast on your shutter speed, but twice as big on your opening. So one click on shutter speed and one click in the other direction on aperture on your camera will give you the same amount of light. Again, if this is the first time you're hearing this, go somewhere and read up on exposure, because I can't teach you everything you need to know in a couple of minutes here on exposure. But it's important stuff to know. And even if you're not using the manual settings on your camera, understanding how your camera is making those decisions really is important. Now, here's the key piece on this, is that you might say, well, boy, I'll just use the fastest shutter speed I can, because why wouldn't I? Then I don't have camera shake, I can freeze the action. Nothing comes for free. And so if you use a fast shutter speed, that means your hole is small. So your aperture number is big, your f-stop number is big. Your hole is very small. No, that's different, sorry. Faster shutter speed, you have to have a bigger hole, and that's going to affect your depth of field. So I explained that badly, but let me do a better job here. Depth of field is the amount front to back, so from you into the distance, how much of that, what the range of that is that's in focus around your subject. A shallow depth of field means that the eye of the frog that you're taking a picture of is going to be in focus, but the rest of the body's out of focus. A deeper depth of field, a bigger depth of field means that more of that frog is going to be in focus. And there's a trade-off between aperture and depth of field. So the bigger the hole, the less depth of field you have. And the smaller the hole, the more depth of field. So if you think about, for those of you who this applies to, if at any point in your life you've woken up in the morning without your glasses or your contacts in, you tried to squint to see what time it is, the reason you're squinting is your eye is making the aperture smaller, which increases your depth of field. It makes it easier to see what you're looking for. Your camera does the same thing with a smaller aperture. So here's some examples. We saw this photo earlier. This is a shallow depth of field. The drop of water is in focus. Everything else is out of focus because the depth of field is pretty shallow. And this comes along with macro photography. Macro lenses don't give you a lot of depth of field when you're really in close to something. You can really see the depth of field here because I wanted the face of this bee to be in focus. And if you look at the leaf, you can see the zone of the leaf that's in focus. Everything else is out of focus. telephoto lenses have some of this too. So when you're taking a photo of a bird, a lot of the surroundings are going to be out of focus because the depth of field is going to be shallow. So this is, again, where you really want to make sure the eye is sharp. And the other thing with this is usually when you're doing wildlife photography with birds, you want the fastest shutter speed you can because you're holding a long lens and you've got a bird that's moving. But fast shutter speed means a bigger aperture, and a bigger aperture means less depth of field. So it's going to be something that's going to happen both because of the optics of the lens and often because of the situation. So in this case, I wanted a photo of this bumblebee where the bumblebee was sharp, and I knew that the background was going to be out of focus, but I didn't want it to be so out of focus that people couldn't tell what it was. So I used an aperture number here that was pretty high, so like f16, f22, something like that, in order to get better depth of field and show more of that background context. And if not in focus, at least reasonable. And depth of field isn't really good or bad, right? Again, it's something you want to control. So the difference between these two photos is just the aperture size. So the one on the left had a bigger hole, a bigger aperture size, or a smaller aperture number, f-stop number, which allows for and a slower shutter speed. The one on the right had a larger aperture. Again, neither one is better or worse. The one on the right has a cleaner background, which I appreciate, but that's an artistic choice. And so I tend to, when I'm taking pictures of bugs and flowers and things like that, I tend to want the background to be sort of fuzzed out because it makes a clean portrait of whatever it is I'm taking photos of. But there are times where the background can also show context. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I would say though, between this photo and this photo, I like the second one better, partly because I like the cleaner background. And then again here, I was trying to get a photo of this shooting star, which was, 4 inches from my wide angle lens, but I also wanted the mountains in the background to be relatively in focus. So I used an aperture setting that allowed that to happen. So f16, f22, something, a big number. So here are some photos with clean backgrounds, nice simple portraits. And then these are others that have, background that you can see and it provides some value to the photo. So again, it's not good or bad, just know what you're getting and why. If you're having trouble with depth of field, especially with macro photography, one trick to help you is to try to get everything that you want, everything that's really important to be in focus, get it the same distance from your camera by moving yourself and your camera around to a different angle. So the top left photo there, those side oats grandma, all those flowers are the same distance from the camera because my camera is completely, exactly perpendicular to that flower head. And the flowers to the right of it, those 2 yellow flowers that are in focus because they were the same distance from the camera. I positioned myself so that they were both exactly the same distance and I could focus on both of them at the same time. So that's a way to work around some of these issues of having a shallow depth of field when you're doing close-up photography. So again, here's one where the eye of the butterfly is in focus. It's a really neat shot of a monarch. You can see the tongue is in focus. But if I wanted to show the wings in focus, I have to move myself around to a different angle, and then I can show the whole thing. And neither is right or wrong. Okay, we should stop for questions here. It's 1:30. If people want to stick around, please feel free. I can stay till 2. I'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And if you have to leave, thank you very much for coming. I hope it was worthwhile.
I echoed that. All right, let's get to some of these. A couple people have asked you about your favorite photo organizing, ways to organize or software to organize photos.
Yeah, I have a Microsoft computer. I have a PC. And the way I tend to organize my photos is that I put them, I use Windows to help me search for things, which actually works pretty well. And so with my photos, I do 2 things. I put a low resolution image of every photo I've ever taken into one folder, and I can do a search in that folder. I just go up to the top of the folder and I search for keywords, and I can find what I want. And the reason I can is that when I'm in Photo Mechanic, which I talked about earlier, every photo that I'm going to keep, I enter data into. I put location, I put caption information, I put my name, so that I can search for all that stuff later. And that takes time, but it's well worth it when you start to build up a library of images. So I can have one folder with all those images. I can search for a keyword, and I can find every image that matches that keyword. But the other thing I do is I have a bunch of folders in another place that are set up by topic. So I'll have an invertebrates photo that has subfolders for butterflies and dragonflies and ants and things like that. I'll have one for flowers, I'll have one for grasses, one for scenics, one for prairies, whatever. And then if I'm doing a presentation where I just need to pull some photos on a topic, I can go to those folders, and that's an easier way to find things. So that's how I do it. But you're right, there are software programs out there that are designed specifically to help you organize things. I just haven't used them much. I've tried a couple, and I didn't find that they were any better than Microsoft Windows for what I'm trying to do. But the key thing, the thing is important is to get your metadata into those photos. And a program like Photo Mechanic, you can do it in Photoshop also, but it's really easy in a thing like Photo Mechanic because you can copy and paste the same information to a bunch of photos that need the same information.
How do you get the water? This was from about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago. How do you get the waterfall to look like that? Does that make sense to you, Chris?
Yeah, so there's two ways to shoot a waterfall. I mean, there's a lot of ways to shoot a waterfall. But you can use a fast shutter speed to freeze the droplets so they're frozen in place and it looks like it's a frozen in time photo. That's great. If you want to show the water moving, you want to use the slowest shutter speed that you can, given the amount of light you have. And so a lot of those are, you're seeing that they were like a 1/10 of a second or maybe a 20th of a second, which is just enough time for all those water drops to move enough that it looks like they're smeared across the screen, and that makes it look like the water's moving.
Chris, I got two questions about the manual function. Manual function seems like it puts you in more control of the way you see the photo you are taking, but can sometimes put it out of focus. Why is that?
Boy, I don't know. And I'm assuming here we're talking about manual focusing. No, well, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm not sure what they're asking. Sorry.
And feel free to clarify in the Q&A.
With manual focus, when I do macro photography, close-up stuff, I'm almost always using manual focus, because what I can do is I can get my focus set on the lens, and then I can very gradually push or pull my lens or my whole camera, often on the tripod, a little bit back and forth as I'm taking some pictures to make sure that I'm getting the exact right focus. And so I bracket. I take a lot of pictures of the same thing and make sure that it's in focus. And I try to vary that distance very slightly to help. But I don't know if that's exactly what they were asking.
Okay, and then in manual mode, how and why would you control the ISO setting?
Okay, I was ready for this question. I'm glad you asked it because I didn't have time to get to it normally, but I'm going to do it now very quickly. So the ISO setting is set up to help you when you don't have enough light for the settings that you need, especially shutter speed. And they used to use this on cameras, on film cameras, and you'd buy film at different ISO numbers. The downside of using ISO is that it makes a grainier image. So you can bump your ISO up on a camera if you're out and it's late in the day and you're taking a picture and it looks like the picture is either too dark or too blurry and you can't make it get better. Change your ISO, and that'll allow you to take a picture with less light and still make a good image. The problem is it's going to be grainy. So here's an extreme part of that, or extreme example, where there's a starry sky. This was a photo that was like a 30-second exposure at a very high ISO because I wanted to capture a lot of low light through my camera. But if you zoom in on this, there's a lot of graininess to that picture because it's a very high ISO number. Digital cameras now handle ISO better than they used to, but it's not a magic number that you can just set a high ISO number without any disadvantages. So use it if you need it to. If you're in really low light, you just have to stop the action, but recognize that there's a downside, which is you're going to have grainy photos. Okay, good. I'm glad that was a question.
So somebody here was new at this. She
Okay.
wants to know, what would be a good setting for shooting a bird with a telephoto lens?
So when you're trying to take wildlife photos with a telephoto lens, almost all the time you want to maximize your shutter speed. So use the lowest number f-stop or aperture that you can, whatever your camera allows, so, or whatever your lens allows. So a lot of times you might have like a 300 millimeter 5.4 lens. What that means is 5.4 is the smallest f-stop you can get with that lens. Set it at 5.4, use the fastest shutter speed you possibly can, because it'll help you make the camera steady and also freeze the action. And you don't care about depth of field most of that time anyway. You just want to get that bird in focus. And again, if you're using a 400 millimeter lens, you want at least a 400th of a second shutter speed, but faster is better. You know, anything in that 1,000 to 2,000 or higher is going to be really helpful.
Okay, here's a longer one. With macro lenses, have you found better results using a dedicated macro lens, 90 millimeter / 105 millimeter, or using various extension tubes?
Yeah. Extension tubes I use only when I want to do something kind of crazy, like I showed you with that one flower photo. I like having a dedicated macro lens, because then you can focus all the way out to infinity. You don't, with an extension tube, you're really limited on the range that you can focus on front to back. And there are times where you're like, oh man, this photo looks great, but now I have to take the extension tube off. By the time you get the extension tube off and the lens back on, then your whatever your subject has gone away. And you know, with the cost of dedicated macro lenses right now, you can buy a good used lens for a few $100s. To me, that's worth the money rather than trying to adapt another lens with an extension tube.
Thanks, Chris. So how durable are these DSLR cameras? We have a D7000 and I'd be nervous to take it out when it's actively snowing. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, they're pretty good. Most of them are pretty well sealed up. I mean, I wouldn't dunk it in water for sure, but I've had my camera out in pretty rainy, snowy conditions, and I've tried to protect it as much as I can. But I've never really had trouble with the environment causing problems. You know, one thing, actually, the biggest issue can sometimes be really cold and then bringing it into a warm area, and you get condensation that can get inside the camera. So I have to be really careful with that, right? If you have a camera bag, put your camera in the camera bag while you're still outside if it's below 0 or something. Bring it inside, let it warm up gradually in the bag, and then pull it out. Don't pull it out right away when you get in the car or the house. But in terms of being sealed up and durable, I've had really good luck with my cameras over the years. I haven't had too much trouble. Even, you know, bumping them on things, they survive pretty well.
Do you use Photoshop to make details in the dark shadows of a picture that aren't there, or do you just enhance the details that are already present?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I enhance the details that are already present. And I usually am not doing that very dramatically. I showed you a dramatic example earlier because I wanted to show you what can be done. But for most photos that I do, I don't do a lot of that. But I do it if I need to show, again, what my eyes saw or what somebody that would have been with me would have seen that day. And so I can bring out the details that are in the shadows that are there, but aren't able to be captured by the sensor.
What does it mean if your camera is in full frame?
So a full frame camera, a digital camera, I think what this is asking about is a full frame sensor. And so they're like with Nikon, there are DX cameras and there are FX cameras. I have a DX camera, which is less than a full frame. It's a smaller sensor than a more expensive camera would be, which would be a full frame. And the only difference is the size of that sensor. And with my lenses, because the sensor is a little smaller, the lenses act as like a little bit longer focal length. So again, it's like 50% longer focal length on my camera than it would be with Mike Forsberg's FX camera, which is a full frame sensor. But the DX cameras on Nikon, for example, are cheaper, which is why I'm using them. And they're still plenty good resolution to get magazine photos. And I've never had anybody really complain about the resolution of my image. But if I was, again, going to be doing, you know, bird photography, trying to photograph raptors flying around, I would want a bigger, more expensive camera. And then I would bump up to the higher resolution full frame sensor. But for me right now, that's just not enough of a priority to spend the money. And then I'd have to retrofit a lot of my lenses and get new lenses to meet that full frame camera. I'll probably do it at some point.
Do you selective meter only by moving the focal point around? Please explain again how you took your focus point and held it to a new place.
Yeah. This is something that is probably smart to look at the manual for your camera, because cameras do this very differently. But the general procedure is I can, in my camera, I can push the shutter button down halfway, and it gives me a little, I use spot metering, right? So you can use matrix metering or spot metering or center weighted metering. There's a lot of different options. I use spot metering almost all the time. Meaning that there's one little rectangle inside that's the frame, and that's where the light reading is coming from. And then I have a wheel on my camera where I can move that around inside the frame after pushing my shutter button down halfway to see it. I can move it where I want so that I know exactly where the light reading is coming from for that photo. And again, every camera's, the way that you do that is going to be different. But most cameras, even phones, if you look into it, can sometimes have that ability to change where the camera is metering. Sometimes with a cell phone, it's the same as the focus. So if you push your button on a certain area to focus, a lot of times I think that also affects where the meter reading is coming from. So that's another way to do it.
Are you changing lenses in the field or mostly sticking with one? If changing in the field, how do you keep lenses clean?
Carefully. Yeah, I do change lenses a lot, especially between my wide angle and my macro lens. Those are the two that I use more than anything else. And basically, I just do it quickly. You know, I have the next lens in my hand, ready to go. I pop the first lens off, stick the second one on, cap the first one as quickly as I can. I try to shield myself if it's a windy, dusty day or something like that. And then, you know, when I start to get dust spots on the sensor, I clean the sensor. I order the little liquid and the little swabs, and I clean off my sensor when I start getting dusted, which happens because you're outside. But, you know, you just try to limit the amount of time. I've had people tell me that it makes a difference if you turn your camera off before you do that. I'm pretty lazy about that, but I suppose it's possible that there's some electromagnetic static that helps, you know, attract dust particles, and maybe it makes a difference to turn your camera off also.
Do you use HDR or focus stacking techniques for any professional work?
You know, I really haven't. I've read about them. I appreciate the photos that I see that use those techniques, but I for whatever reason, I've never gotten into it, so I don't.
Oh, Dawn just mentioned that she tries to keep the camera facing down while she swaps.
Yep, that's also a good idea. Yep.
Yep. Do you use filters on your lenses ever?
I don't. I used to use a polarizer lens sometimes. And there are times where I sometimes wish I had one, but a lot of times I can do in Photoshop what a polarizer would do for me in the field, at least enough that I don't have to worry about another thing. And the other thing with filters that it just bothers me putting another layer of glass between me and the image. You know, I try to buy lenses that are really good quality, and there are coatings on those lenses, and they're clean. And the idea of putting a cheaper piece of glass in front of the glass that I just spent a lot of money on and degrading the quality of photo just bothers me. And so, you know, like a lot of people I know will put a UV filter on to help protect the lens, which I understand. But again, you just spent a bunch of money on a lens, and now you're putting a cheap piece of plastic or glass in front of it and shooting through that. It's like shooting through the window of your car rather than opening the window first. So to me, I just want to be careful with my lenses and not put filters on.
Could you please discuss the use of neutral density and gradient filters in nature photography?
Yeah, so along those same lines, I mean, I don't know the second filter you talked about. Neutral density filters are helpful for dealing with a light intensity issue. And without going into the great detail, basically what you have is a square, often, filter that you put in front of the lens. And as you go from top to bottom, it increases in the density. It lets less light in toward the bottom of the filter than the top. And you can kind of hold that in front of your camera lens and then move it up and down so that, for example, if if your sky is too bright, you can flip that filter and you can darken the sky and still allow all the light to come down and hit the camera from, you know, this reflecting off the ground. And then you can move that around to try to adjust density. To me, I've never had a lot of luck with them. I've never liked them. They change the color. And I would much rather do what I talked about earlier, which is try to shoot on the dark side, shoot on the darker end of the spectrum, and then try to open up those details later in Photoshop. I've had much better luck with that than using neutral density filters. But I also know people who really like them and who do great photos with them, so that it's apparently something that people can make work.
Do you use live screen in back of camera to take photos or just to review?
I don't use that when I'm taking the pictures, except on my cell phone, because that's what I have, right? But on my real camera, on my DSLR camera, no. I look through the viewfinder, I put my eye right up to it, and then I just use the screen to check things later. Mostly because you just don't have the resolution to see whether something's in focus. And if it's a bright day, you get the glare that we already talked about. It's problematic for me in most situations outdoors.
Guess what, Chris? We've reached, I think, the end of our questions. So
Right.
I'll take this moment just to say, if you think of another one in the next couple minutes, we'll keep Chris on. But I did want to mention to everyone, the next one of these events is on July 1st. The next in our Nature Unites Us online learning series is July 1st, same time, 12:30 p.m. Central Time. And that'll be with our Water and Agriculture Program Manager, Jacob Fritton. And you can find all of these, the links to register for all of these on nature.org/Nebraska. So I really encourage you to join in other conversations that we'll be having. Some will be panel discussions, some will be just presentations and lectures. So we hope to see some familiar names on those lists as well. Just wanted to mention that, as we still do have about 100 people on with us.
That's great. I'm trying to look through here to see. Peg was asking about what model Samsung phone I have. I have an S10, S10e technically is what I'm shooting with right now. I had an S8 before that I also loved. Samsung I've been really happy with. Not that other cameras don't do a good job also, but I would say my wife had an iPhone, and after we went hiking together, she looked at my photos and looked at her photos, and she bought a Samsung, and she likes it a lot better. But that's just one person's experience.
I've gotten a couple questions about whether or not this presentation will be recorded. It was recorded, and we're going to get closed captioning for it over the next couple days with TNC's video team. And then we will be sending out the link to all participants, and it will also be available online.
Somebody said we should mention websites. So here's the nature.org, which is the Nature Conservancy's website, and Nebraska has its own page, of course. And then I have a blog that I write called The Prairie Ecologist that has a lot of photos, natural history, land management, restoration, all sorts of things on it too, if you want to check that out.
All right. Well, with that, oh, one more question, Chris.
Okay.
Do you use a hood on your lens?
Do I what?
Do you use a hood on your lens?
Almost never, and I don't know why. I guess if I was doing a lot of photography with a telephoto lens, I might use it more, and I would buy a lens that has a dedicated hood on it to try to keep glare off of it for wildlife stuff. The wide angle lenses I use, which I tend to use a lot more of, some of them come with a hood, but it tends to get in the way. I have a hard time keeping track of it in my bag. So I don't use it, and every once in a while I'll hold my hand up to try to, deflect glare, but it's usually not much of an issue. So there's nothing wrong with them. I just haven't used them much.
All right, that was that was the end of all of our questions. So we're so grateful that you sent in such wonderful questions, everyone, and took some time out of your day to hang out with your friends at the Nature Conservancy. And we hope to see you throughout the summer online. Chris, I'll let you have the last word.
Thanks very much, everybody. If you have questions that we didn't get to, you can track me down through Eliza. Send them to her if she's okay with that, and I'm happy to try to email you back and try to answer them. Or if I did a poor job of answering your question, you can do the same thing.
Okay.
Thanks very much, guys.
Take care, everyone. Be safe.
Yep.